Hi everyone, and welcome back to our HaPi podcast, Healthcare and Pharmaceutical Insights. This series is going to be looking at launch excellence, and in this series I'm going to be speaking to a number of guests who all have experience of launching either products, companies or services, and will be able to offer some valuable advice to you if you're in that space. So sit back, relax and enjoy. Hi everyone, and welcome back to another wonderful session of HaPi. And just as a reminder, HaPi stands for Healthcare and Pharmaceutical Insights podcast. And once again, I have another tremendous guest to join with me today, somebody who I've been speaking to recently, and I very quickly realised that this person would be a superb person to come on HaPi for this series on launch excellence. So welcome Rachel Ainsworth. Rachel, welcome. Thank you for coming on and a place to share your insights and your knowledge into this title of launch excellence. Do you want to give us a brief intro into who you are, where you come from, etc.?
Yeah, of course. Well, hi, Colin. Thank you very much for inviting me onto the podcast. Very much appreciated. So just a quick potted history of who I am. I've worked in both medtech and pharma, having sort of started my career at Olympus and then at KCI in both sales and marketing roles. And then spent just over a decade really at AstraZeneca in the pharmaceutical part through various different parts of both the mental health and chronic care portfolio, doing, well, I guess, continue my marketing career, but then moving more into the sort of market access and policy space. And then more latterly, I've been at Coloplast heading up their market access team for the UK and Ireland. So, yeah, it's really great to be here.
Good. And you're very welcome. It's great to have you. And another expert within launch excellence that's going to share some knowledge and some tips and some advice, which hopefully people watching this will take a lot from and share or use within their job. So let's kick it off. Launch excellence is a title which we've heard a lot. We hear a lot in discussions, don't we? So from your perspective, Rachel, what would you say is your definition of launch excellence?
Yeah, it's a good question. I guess in its simplest form, I mean, it is successfully launching a new product. But I guess sort of the term and how we've got to know what launch excellence is, I tend to think of it as a recipe. I suppose it maybe comes down to some of my some of the things I quite enjoy when I'm cooking at the weekend, etc. But I think of it as a recipe, if you like, for launching a product. And I'm thinking, what are those successful ingredients? What are the key ingredients that you need in order to make your product survive in what is quite a competitive and quite a tricky environment nowadays, particularly post-COVID. So it's those activities, really, those processes, and probably something that people don't necessarily always think of, but what are those behaviours that are necessary, when you're starting to think about how you're going to launch a product and how you're going to get it to marketplace. So I guess it's that operational excellence and ensuring that you're all working towards a sort of common goal.
Good. That's a brilliant way of putting it. You've already secured your first snippet of this as we go into the next few weeks.
Fabulous.
From a recipe perspective. I love that the way in which you've put that across and a kind of clear and simple way of defining it. But that's excellent. That's really clever. And what's been your own experience through all the you touched on there, obviously the different companies you've been working with and involved in. So what's been your own experience of launching?
No, I actually feel quite privileged in some of the product launches I've been involved in. As I said, I've got both medtech and pharma experience. So I guess one of the sort of early product launches I was involved in was something called vacuum assisted closure, which at the time was innovative. And that's maybe another podcast for another time around what the definition of innovation is, because I know that's quite a hot topic at the moment, particularly from a medtech perspective. And being involved in that from a marketing perspective gives you a very different angle than it was, say, more latterly. And within Coloplast, we just launched 2 products, or in the process of one a catheter and one a quite a groundbreaking innovation for a digital ostomy device, and coming at it from a market access perspective, which again, to me, it's all part of the same team, but I think it just gives you a slightly different perspective and understanding where you sit in with that. And I'll perhaps touch on some of this later on in our podcast, but you know, how those teams work together and seeing it from those different angles, I think has given me quite a maybe not a unique, but quite a holistic sort of approach to life. So yeah,
I'm interested on that because obviously in terms of what I do day to day from a recruitment perspective and speaking to clients and candidates, we speak to them both on pharma and medtech. And there's not actually a lot of people that I would say that I speak to that have got, you know, a huge amount of experience in either side. You do, and you know, you've managed to gain different experience and different understandings of how pharma operates in this space and how medtech operates in this space. Where's the similarities? Where's the complete, you know, differences as well? So that would be interesting, I think, for people watching this, because there's a good mix of people across pharma and medtech who are linked to me and certainly obviously to what I do on a daily basis. What are the key things then that you would say that you need to consider, or we consider when you get to launching?
So I think probably one of the key things, and we'll talk about sort of what the sort of top tips are maybe a little bit later, but it's about starting early and it's about starting your activities early. And I think probably from my experience, I don't think you can ever start early enough. I think everybody always says, oh, I wish I'd started this, you know, last year or the year before. But in no particular order. So some of the things I was having to think about this around, you know, what has made the difference. I think absolutely that early engagement with your key stakeholders is pretty critical. Whether that be from a clinician perspective, whether you're speaking to your clinicians, you know, to gather clinical evidence, or whether it's from a KOL perspective. And actually a lot of that, they can help feed into some of the other parts, which is like, you know, developing your value proposition and thinking about what your sort of launch activities will later on, and helping you develop those sort of that real understanding of the marketplace and what is going to differentiate yourself. So real early engagement with your key your key stakeholders is probably critical. And it's not just the clinicians. Again, I think we forget that, you know, we've got payer stakeholders in the environment that we're working in nowadays. There's such a key stakeholder. So thinking about, you know, who those are, and even from a government level, you know, you think about what's happening, particularly given the fact that we're likely to get a new government in soon. You know, what will their life sciences strategy be? You know, how are we engaging with those stakeholders? How are we showing, you know, and showcasing what we've got and using that, you know, to our advantage and helping make sure that we have the best possible launch. So that's probably one of the key things. I touched on it as well when I mentioned that, is about having a clear value proposition. You know, and I think that comes really from and there's a few little strands that sort of build into this. So, you know, what is your unmet need? You know, have you really defined what that unmet need is? And actually, are you establishing that in your lead up to launch? Again, everything's a priority in the NHS. So, you know, really making sure that that's sort of developed. But with your clear value proposition, again, how are you differentiating yourself from what is current standard of care? Or if there are other competitors, you know, how are you differentiating yourself there? And I think that's really important to be able to do. And sort of building on that is making sure that you've got the right evidence. So you've got the right clinical evidence, the right health economic evidence. What does that look like? Is it a full-blown trial? Is it real-world evidence, which we know is becoming more and more common these days? Again, depending on what your product is, whether it's anything from an orphan drug through to something that's going to be a blockbuster, you know, how you gather that evidence, etc., is going to be very different. So thinking about that really early in the process is pretty critical, I think, in order to get that through. One of the other things I mentioned as well before was around sort of insights, and actually, are we doing research It's very common, and as I say, I've seen it when I worked at, in the pharmaceutical industry and also in medtech, where we do a lot of research with our clinical customers, and trying to understand what the clinician behaviors are, and really kind of digging deep to kind of find that real nugget of deep insight.
Mm-hmm.
But are we doing the same with our payer stakeholders? Are we doing it with the patients as well, to really understand what that patient journey is, and how the patients are moving through the system, for example? Are we trying to uncover something here that can really add value into what our overall proposition is? So I think really understanding and getting those good nuggets of deep insight are quite critical. And something that probably, and I talked about it at the start around the behaviours, is, are we set up as an organisation? I think that's the other thing. Or are you set up as an organisation to have a really coordinated approach to launch? And I've experienced it, and I'm sure many of the people listening will have, where you have, for example, you might have market access who need particular type of evidence, and yet the trials that are going on and the evidence that's being gathered is great, but it's actually feeding into a lot of the marketing activities. And actually, are we missing tricks in some of the data that we could be gathering? So I think it's so critical when you're looking at your launch excellence plans. Are you making sure that you've got common goals and that there is complete transparency and communication right across the board?
Across the board.
Because I think that's one of the things that gets missed. And then I guess just a final sort of piece at the end as well is how are you measuring it? We get all stuck into sort of creating the plans and putting together great plans, but how can you track, and are you tracking that you are basically
achieving what you want to achieve?
100%. And making sure that you've got those sort of ticked off, and that you're doing those regular check-ins to make sure that you are on track and that you are heading to where you need to be. I mean, I'm sure this stat's been pulled up before, but I think it's something like 80% of products that do well in the first 6 months succeed. So it's so critical to make sure that you are tracking up to that.
What I like about it in terms of how you've covered that question there, Rachel, is that you're constantly asking questions, which I get maybe is what you will do throughout that process. What are we doing? Are we doing it? Are we doing it well? It's part of that kind of, as you say, that kind of early tracking phase. Are we speaking to the right people? Is everybody involved? And there's also, which has been in the last few conversations I've had with people about this subject, the very clear area which underpins this is having that teamwork beside, because there's so many people involved internally and externally. Obviously, from a key perspective internally, you need to know, one, you've got a good team, and secondly, that team is all agreed, accountable, and signed up to what it is that ultimately you're looking to achieve. And then from there, then you obviously can bring in your external team, if you want to say, in terms of your clinicians, your patients, people that are involved from an external perspective. And if you've got your internal team right, that message will, in my view anyway, that message will automatically go out in a positive manner to your external team, because everybody's bought in, everybody's fully aware of what's going on. So it's not an effort to try and engage external people, because your internal people are so on board with what's going on. But that seems to be the kind of backbone that I've seen that's coming through any of the conversations I've had. So I've had a really strong team, everybody committed to it, and constantly having that accountability towards each other.
I couldn't agree more, Colin. And actually, it seems like an obvious thing, because you think, well, we're all, we're here to launch the product, and surely, therefore, we're all, we're all working in the same direction. But it's not necessarily always so. You might have conflicting priorities. And I think it's about, how do you make sure that when you have those conflicting priorities, that you've got a good process that makes sure that you are, you are all back on track and on the, heading towards the same goal. as I say, on paper, it sounds so easy, but
I know.
The practicalities of it means that it's not. So it's so critical. And that's where I talk about the behaviors and that launch excellence mindset throughout the company. And it's not just in, I guess the more obvious functions. It's thinking about the whole company as a whole and how they, work towards that.
Yeah. Excellent. Good. You kind of touched on some of it in our next kind of question we're going to cover a little bit, but maybe just kind of unpack it a bit for us a little bit more. But what are some of the challenges that you have seen, that you've identified when you've been in this role, or these roles of launch?
I would say the first one I talked about was that coordination piece. As I said, if you've got conflicting priorities, then it can be quite tricky around, is it whose voice is the strongest? And actually you need really, really good, a really good steer, really good project management to make sure that you are heading in the right direction there. So I think that internal coordination is really critical. One of the other things that I've picked up, and it kind of, I suppose, sits within that sort of defining a clear value proposition really, is, do you know who your patient population is? And I've either observed it or been part of it, where I think the NHS wants us to come in when we're launching new products with a really clear patient population. Who is the patient that this drug or this device is going to, ultimately work for? And actually, I think it's really important, because that then leads on to, when you develop your evidence, you're developing it for that particular one. Particular patient archetype. But of course, there are commercial priorities that conflict with that, where you want to go to the widest possible marketplace and get the maximum return on investment. So there's always going to be a challenge there between, do you go wide and sort of spread, if you like, sort of the access to to patients, or do you keep it a very, very fine and defined patient archetype that you go for? That's one I think that many companies struggle with in terms of where they go forward. I think the other piece as well, and I touched on it earlier, is around that customer insight. I think we do, and I have observed really great research around what I would call your sort of classic customer, your clinician, the person that is usually going to prescribe. But I think there's two parts to this: is, are we really capturing really good insight in all our stakeholders? It's not just good enough to be clinically effective anymore. You've got to show that this product, or whether it's a drug or as I say, a device, is it cost effective, particularly in the cash-strapped NHS nowadays? And then you've got other, key stakeholders, like I mentioned before. You've got, politicians, you've got patients, etc. So are we really capturing a full range of stakeholders who will influence whether that product as well or not? So again, that needs to be sort of pulled in. And then I guess the other part to that is, how are we getting that insight? And that again can be quite tricky. Your sort of ad boards and your general market research doesn't always work with some of these, with some of us, key stakeholders. So really thinking about, are there other ways that we can tap those customer insights from? So those are some of the things to start to have
biggest challenges. Yeah, absolutely. And again, I think the one thing I can see is coming through from you, Rachel, is you're constantly asking questions. What are we doing? Are we covering this? Are we looking at this? And there's challenges and there's problems that come up in any job and in any kind of situation. But I think most people who know me relatively well is that there's always a solution. There's always a solution to a problem. There will be a solution to that to a problem, and that solution, might take a long time, or that solution might be right in front of us. But again, if you've got that good team round about you, there should be enough brains and heads and ideas to
absolutely
identify the solution to that challenge, identify the solution to that problem, and overcome it. And in pharma and medtech, there's a lot of brilliant people who can do that and can create these solutions, isn't there?
No, absolutely. And again, thinking about how you harness your internal capabilities. So it's not just, you have, field teams out there that are constantly talking to, customers. How are we harnessing the information that you pull back in there, right the way through to, if you've got, customer service or that type, how are we starting to track this? I mean, I can always remember one of the conversations that we had, around when you're starting to pull in, your adverse events reporting. Are there actually insights that we can forage around from some of that, in order to sort of pull through? So there's not always the obvious things that you need to look at. Are there other avenues that you can explore to sort of mine that?
Yeah.
So.
And there's so many different, even from our job and on a daily basis within recruitment, there's so many different tools now and software tools available for us to create the challenges that we have within our job, which is ultimately finding talent, or in some cases trying to find new jobs. But there's always ways around that to try and help us and enhance it. And it's the same in everything. And it might take time. And sometimes there's problems that are so crucial that can't be solved. But I'm a great believer in that there's always a solution to that. So good. So in order to kind of wrap all this up, somebody watching this just now, Rachel's looking at this going, right, but I've got somebody here who's got loads of experience, who's shared a lot of brilliant knowledge. I'm right in this area just now. I'm about to launch, or perhaps there's somebody looking at this and going, I'm moving into this type of role. What are some kind of tips or practical advice that you can offer people in that position right now?
Yeah, I did touch on one of them earlier, but it is around early engagement. I said, whatever you do, it will never be early enough. So if you're thinking about starting it tomorrow, start it yesterday.
Yeah.
Because
okay. Love that. Yeah.
Never enough time. So, and particularly with a lot of the stakeholder engagement, think about some of those sort of key criteria that you go through in your sort of launch excellence framework. How can you pull on some of those external stakeholders and potentially your internal stakeholders as well, early, and get them involved and start to get them engaged into the process? So absolutely start things early, or earlier than you think you need to. I think one of the other things is, again, know who your target audience is. And that's not just, in terms of who you're selling to, but I talked about it before around, who is your target patient population, for example. So I think being really clear and actually having a really clear value proposition that talks to that. I think particularly nowadays where the NHS, as I said to you before, is struggling, and it is getting more and more difficult to launch, particularly in the UK. So really starting to think about, are you able to communicate really clearly, what the value is, and also who you're communicating to is really clear.
Good.
One of the other sort of top tips is probably the learning part, and I think if everybody really asks themselves, do they do this? Because you launch a product and you get wrapped up in the fact that, you've launched it, it's been a success, and you're all sort of patting yourselves on the back. But are you taking the time to say, stop, what went well, what didn't go so well, and what can we do better? Particularly if you've got new launches coming through the pipeline as well. And although, yes, things need to be tweaked because you've got different product launch archetypes that will obviously depend on your strategy, that you take to launch. But actually, are we really understanding what went well and maybe what we would tweak for sort of future launches, and making that an integral part of your launch excellence plan? It can sometimes get missed in the euphoria of the sort of post-launch period. So make sure that that's given due diligence and due time to make sure that you learn from it. And then I guess the final piece of advice is just be agile. Things change. I mean, I have never known a launch that you start off with your early plans and then the same plan is it's the same plan at the end. It just doesn't happen.
No.
So it's about making sure that you're set up to be agile, that you're set up to tweak and change, and make sure that that you can embrace that and encompass that sort of along the journey.
And it's allowing, I think, having the space within, again, that team environment for that change to happen. And I would imagine as well, making people aware at the start, saying, right, this is the kickoff plan, but we can guarantee by the time we get to the end there'll be a number of changes and tweaks in between that. So be prepared for that. We're all different. We're all different beasts. We're all different people. And we need to be prepared that what we think at the start is going to be, this is going to be exactly how it works. Probably not. We'll still get to the end point. The end point that's there, but occasionally we'll go. I use the phrase occasionally. We'll go off piste occasionally, on plan, or maybe come back on plan or whatever if needs be. But no, that's really helpful. Really helpful advice. Rachel, this has been brilliant. Really, really good. A lot of practical advice. One thing that we try and do within the podcast, and the kind of reason for it, is to share with each other. I think we're part of an industry, within pharma and medtech. Sometimes we keep ourselves, I can't share that. No, come on, I don't agree with that. There's obviously lines that we, special reason that we know, that we don't cross. But there's so much talent, wisdom, and experience within pharma and medtech that can enhance the industry that we've been part of for a long time and will continue to be part of for a long time. So thank you for that. Thank you for sharing all that information, and I do appreciate you coming on board.
No, and thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure to come onto the podcast. So thank you, Colin, for that.
Great stuff. And everybody watching, please enjoy. Any questions or whatever, add them in the comments. I feel like a little bit of a YouTube type person to say that, but I'm not going to do any pointing, etc. People know what to do. Share it. Send us some comments, and we'll be back with another episode very, very soon. Okay, thanks very much. Thanks, Rachel. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.